morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are now in week 13 of our course on the history of British art. And today I'd like to talk with you about the turn of the 20th century, the period of modernism, the beginning of what we might even identify as modern art in the early 20th century, and then the period of the First World War. The first half of the 20th century will basically keep us occupied for the next 2 weeks, and there are some documentaries online if you want more on that. There are two documentary miniseries, both by the BBC. One is called British Masters. This is a three-part documentary by art historian James Fox about precisely that, the beginning of the 20th century up to the Second World War. So this might be interesting for this week and the next week. And the second documentary I'd like to recommend to you is also three-part, also by the BBC, by the art historian called Andrew Graham Dixon. The title is British Art at War. He mostly means the First World War, and there are 3 episodes devoted to 3 major painters of this period. Paul Nash, David Bomberg, and Walter Sickert. So we are going to talk about these painters today and next week, and then we'll see how we go from there. And if you manage to find it, there is yet another interesting documentary, slightly older one. This is called Sickert versus Sargent, and this is exactly what we are going to discuss in the first part of this week's video. So the comparison, and also in terms of similarities, of the 2 great turn of the century painters, John Singer Sargent and Walter Sickert. So it's too loud. We have to move to some other place. We'll continue in a minute. So we are back inside. It's just too noisy to record anything in the garden. So welcome back, and let's start with the discussion of the first 2 great painters of the early 20th century, or the turn of the 20th century. Actually, I managed to find this BBC documentary called Sickert versus Sargent. It is directed in the form resembling a boxing match. So they are like 2 boxers fighting for the title of the best English painter of the turn of the 20th century. What is interesting, none of these 2 painters were British by birth. John Singer Sargent, slightly older of the 2, was born in America. He then emigrated to Great Britain, and in the opinion of many art historians, he is the last great British portrait painter, in the tradition going all the way to Van Dyck. He became the chronicler of the beautiful people of the Edwardian period. The Edwardian period was named after King Edward VII, the son and successor of Queen Victoria. So after she died in 1901, he took the throne, and he sat there for almost 10 years in this period, quite characteristic period at the beginning of the 20th century, just before the wars, the world wars started, is named after him. So John Singer Sargent, an American expatriate artist working in Britain, and Walter Sickert, born in 1860, whose family were Danish and German. So he was also from outside, but he moved to Britain, and he had a long career there. He died only in 1942, not as a result of the Second World War. He died of basically natural causes and advanced age. So it's quite interesting to see these two painters because they share some interests. Like both of them were very interested in the theater, but they represent also quite strikingly different views on the techniques of painting, on the function of painting in the very late 19th century and early 20th century. So it's quite interesting to compare their work. You'll have quite a few illustrations in the PowerPoint presentation. Of course, all the documentaries have even more paintings to look at. So we need to start with perhaps an obvious fact that the popularization of photography changed painting very dramatically, because before the popularization of the photographic techniques, people who wanted to immortalize something like their own images or some places, the only way to do it was in painting. After photography became cheap and reliable and available, anybody could have a realistic portrait or a realistic landscape of some favorite place. So the role of painting started to be perceived differently. Rather than immortalizing the physical reality, painters started to reinterpret it. So they started to experiment with different lights. They started to experiment with different I would say bolder techniques, which eventually in the early 20th century led to the birth of abstract art, which started to lose realism altogether. So if we look at some works, at some paintings by John Singer Sargent, he is still quite traditional in a way that his work is mostly realistic. He made his name in the art world by producing beautiful, skillfully produced portraits of the rich and famous, of the society ladies. Some say it's in the style of Van Dyck. There is a lot of focus on the beauty of the sitter, on the beautiful clothes and different textures of the clothes that they are wearing. There is also, as the best English portrait artists would do, the likes of Reynolds and Gainsborough, an attempt to catch the personality of the sitter. It's perhaps most visible in the portrait that Sargent made of Ellen Terry, the great late Victorian actress. He portrayed her in one of her starring roles as Lady Macbeth, and it is of course recognizably Ellen Terry, but it's also a very dramatic moment from Shakespeare's play, and the actress is wearing a very elaborate and very dramatic costume, especially the dress. The dress was actually discovered a few years ago in some magazine, and it was decorated with thousands of beetle wings, kind of shimmering blue-green beetle wings made from actual insects, so like natural sequins really, but they also add to this kind of drama and ominous quality of the character of Lady Macbeth. So we have some shocking portraits, like the portrait of a woman called Madame X, although everybody knew who she was, who is shown dressed in a particularly low-cut gown, which looks like it's falling off her shoulders to reveal her beautiful décolletage and almost revealing her breasts. So this was a shocking, sensual portrait of the society lady. But if we look at some other works by Sargent, he is very interested in the light effects. His probably most famous painting, which is not a simple portrait, is called Carnation, Lily, Lily, Rose, which is apparently taken from some children's nursery rhyme, and it shows two children playing with lanterns, with lit lanterns in the garden at the moment of twilight. So a very, very specific lighting conditions between, let's say, late afternoon and early evening. And we have those lanterns that the children are holding. We have the bright white clothes that are really changing the color with the changing of the daylight into kind of evening lighting conditions. And apparently Sargent painted it out of doors, and he could only have like a quarter of an hour each day to catch the perfect light, to catch the moment he wanted to capture and paint. So this is not really a typical late Victorian painting that tells a story. There is no story here. It's a story perhaps about the innocence and fleeting nature of childhood, but rather than tell a story, he just concentrates on those dramatic and very beautiful lighting conditions. Another example here in the presentation, you have two ladies apparently traveling and taking a break in their travels to have a picnic or something. But the point again is a very typical bright light of the high noon. So once again we have the painter more interested in the lighting conditions than the actual telling of a story, some kind of narration that is very typical for the Victorian painters. And what about Walter Sickert? He was a student and an admirer of yet another expat artist from a slightly older generation, James Abbott McNeill Whistler. So another American who moved to Europe, who was very active artistically in London, and who was a very modern artist in a similar way that many works of Sargent could be seen as modern. So he was more interested in the effects, in, for example, different shades of the white color, which is visible, for example, in his female portrait, actually showing his mistress, but it's called Symphony in White or sometimes the white girl. So we have a young woman wearing a long white dress, portrayed standing on the skin of a white bear, which is of course a different shade of white, and there is a white curtain behind her. So there are all those different subtle changes in the quality of the color that is usually just taken for granted. Those musical titles are quite typical for Whistler, to emphasize that he is not interested in the visual. He is interested rather in the pure qualities of colors that for him would resemble the music rather than, let's say, the narrative paintings of the Victorian period. This even once got him in trouble. The painting that you have in the accompanying presentation, called Nocturne in Black and Gold. Sometimes it's called The Falling Rocket, but it was originally presented as Nocturne in Black and Gold. So once again, this kind of musical title, which was absolutely destroyed by the very important art critic you know already, John Ruskin, who wrote, "This is an outrage, this is a scandal. We have this upstart artist who just throws a can of paint into the face of the British public." And Whistler got so offended that he actually sued Ruskin. The story ended in court, and it ended with a kind of verdict that didn't really satisfy anyone, because Whistler had to pay a fine, but the fine was very, very low, so it was like he was let go. But of course, the lasting effect of this quarrel was public discussion, and for many artists, like the very young artist Walter Sickert, who actually thought initially that he would become an actor rather than a painter, this sparked his interest in painting and in modern painting especially. As I said, Walter Sickert started his career as an actor, and he took inspiration from the theatre, but different theatre than Sargent. He was not really, at least in his youth, a friend of great Shakespearean divas. He knew the people from the music halls, from the cheaper theatres or cabarets, and he would paint such people, sometimes in a style quite resembling the French artists of the day, like Toulouse-Lautrec or Degas. If you look at some of his early works from the late 19th century, showing the actors and the singers from the music hall, and also the audience. He was not interested in the wealthy audience paying for the best seats. He would paint the cheapest seats in the theatre, the gallery, where the poor students and other such people would come to enjoy the performance. So here we have also playing and experimenting with the form, with different perspectives. So we have, for example, in Les Lions Comiques, so he uses sometimes the French titles because this was the fashion in the theatre and the cheap theatre of the day. He uses a strange perspective, as if the actor, the comic actor, is shown from the orchestra pit, rather than from the level of the audience. We have a very interesting painting showing one of the singers called Minnie Cunningham, and she's wearing a bright red dress and hat. So it's almost like something that Toulouse-Lautrec could paint, of a cabaret singer looking tired and not particularly attractive as a female, but still kind of fascinating nevertheless. Because for Walter Sickert, this is really something that he takes very seriously. A different kind of realism, not the kind of idealized realism of Sargent, but dirty, ugly realism. So if he paints women, they are not beautifully dressed in opulent clothes, they are not society ladies, they are, for example, prostitutes. Sickert lived in poor areas of London. He traveled to the continent, but he was never very rich, so he would also stay in poor areas. So he would be a neighbor to some houses of ill repute, and he would sometimes ask the local sex workers to pose for him. So we have also images that really look like something that the Impressionists or the French modern artists from the turn of the century could produce. If we look at the nude paintings of women, they look tired, they look sometimes less attractive. He's not after the physical beauty. He tries to capture the dark side of poverty, the dark side of sex work. So nothing glamorous about these women, and even their nudity is not really erotic. It is the nakedness of tired, sometimes ill people, sometimes even looking dead already. This is quite interesting because if we talk about scandals in the lives of these two painters, definitely Walter Sickert wins all the time, because he was suspected to be Jack the Ripper himself, the notorious serial killer in late 19th century London, murdering prostitutes of Whitechapel district, never caught. There were some people, especially there was a crime fiction writer in the 20th century who believed that she found clues in Sickert's paintings to identify him as Jack the Ripper himself. Actually, he was quite fascinated with the crimes, and in the early years of the 20th century, there was another wave of crimes, I think 2 or 3 murders of prostitutes in Camden Town. These were called Camden Town murders, and they were supposed to be copycat murders similar to the crimes of Jack the Ripper. And Sickert was inspired by that. He would visit the place where the murder happened. He would paint it repeatedly. He would sometimes call the work like the Camden Town Murder, or another title for this is What Shall We Do for Rent? This is actually taken from one of the musical songs, but there is another painting he did, just a dark, poor interior, which is called Jack the Ripper's Room. And of course, here we have, how could he know Jack the Ripper's room? He had to be Jack the Ripper himself. Of course, this is much conjecture. I don't think he was Jack the Ripper. Apparently, he had good alibi for the time that the murders took place. there are some hints, and there is a whiff of scandal. So even if most probably the artist was never involved in any murder himself, he was nevertheless fascinated with those crimes, and perhaps we might identify some dark aspects of that in his work. For example, there is a painting showing a woman reading a newspaper. This is called Le Journal, and this woman is seen like from a downward angle, so her throat is exposed, and there is a string of pearls on her neck, which looks a little bit like a slashed throat with the drops of blood. And the face of the woman is kind of grayish or even green in tone, so perhaps she looks like a dead body. So we have quite a lot of interesting, scandalous things going on. And if you do not mind the spoiler alert, in the view of the creator of this BBC documentary, he says he admires both these painters, but he would give victory to Sickert because, as he puts very, very beautifully, John Singer Sargent completed the 19th century, the great tradition of portraiture, and the great tradition of British painting, but Walter Sickert initiated something new. And as you will see, his career continued. You'll see some of his later works in a moment, and even more of that next week. So we continue in the next part.